to the Weekend Warriors Home Improvement Show, built by Par Lumber. When it comes to big or small projects around the home, Tony and Corey have got the know-how and the answers to make your life just a bit easier. Here they are, your Weekend Warriors, Tony and Corey.
Hey, welcome to the Weekend Warriors Home Improvement Show, built by Par Lumber. I'm Corey Valdez.
And I'm Tony Cookston.
Thanks for tuning in with us today. We've got another great show lined up for you. We have a special guest in the studio with us. His name is Cole Peterson with buildinganadu.com.
Yeah.
He is the national expert on building ADUs, which has taken over.
Yeah.
There are so many ADUs being built in the Portland area. It's crazy. I can't go a week without a set of plans for an ADU landing on my desk.
Yeah.
So Tony and I have talked about this before. We actually had a listener contact us and say, you know, you guys don't know enough about ADUs. You need to get Cole Peterson on your show. So that's what we did. We reached out, and he's sitting in the studio with us. Cole, how are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me over.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're super excited to have you. Obviously, we get a lot of calls from listeners telling us that we don't know enough about what we're talking about, and so
most of the time.
So that begs us to reach out to an expert and get an expert in here to talk to us. And so, and ADUs, as you well know, because you've made a career out of it, are a very, very popular thing. Everybody wants to have an ADU on their property, and we keep saying ADU, and we don't even really know what an ADU is. So let's take a minute, Cole, if you could, and tell us what you do, right? I know that you have a long laundry list of things that you do. Let's talk about the things that you do and a little bit about what an ADU is and why it's so popular.
Sure. So ADUs are secondary housing units on single-family lots, and that definition is kind of simple sounding, but it's actually kind of complicated. It's not a duplex, not a triplex, not a fourplex. It's always a secondary dwelling unit. It's always diminutive, secondary, ancillary to the primary dwelling unit. You can't have an ADU on a commercial, behind a commercial storefront. You can only have an ADU as a secondary structure behind a primary residence or adjacent to a primary residence. And it's a full housing unit, so it has its own sleeping space, sanitation space, cooking space, hangout space. And it's on, generally speaking, on residential lots. It could be on a commercial lot if you had a residential dwelling on a commercially zoned lot, but generally speaking, residences are on residentially zoned lots. So that's kind of the definition of an ADU. And what I do is, pretty much what I've been doing for the last 8 years is assisting homeowners who want to build ADUs on their property by doing a variety of services and informational kind of events for homeowners who want to build an ADU on their property, because it is an enormous undertaking to become a housing developer. If you have zero housing development experience, you have to all of a sudden learn about zoning, and you have to learn about financing. You have to learn about legal issues of legality issues. You have to learn about property management. You have to learn about hiring a general contractor. You have to learn about contract management. You have to learn about small space design. You have to learn about hiring an architect. You have to learn about all these different things that you've never dealt with before as a homeowner. And so my job is to help kind of expedite or facilitate homeowners becoming developers of their own property. And I do that through a book, websites, an ADU tour, classes, consultations, and a variety of other things.
Oh, wow. Is that all you do?
Yeah,
that's a lot.
I see now. It is a lot. I think a conversation gets started about an in-law suite, right? It's a place where the mother-in-law can move in and be close by as she's getting on in years, and or whatever, right? Or maybe even just the in-laws as a couple. Maybe they just want to have them close that you can take care of. And I think that it seems like something that's so simple. I've got a big spot on my property and I just want to build a thing there. Can I just do that? But clearly through that, all of those things that you mentioned, it's a major undertaking. And I think we just kind of overlook a lot of the things that go along with the decision to build an ADU or a mother-in-law suite or a backyard cottage or any one of the other 64 names that it has got.
An accessory dwelling unit.
Yeah.
That's a very...
it's a mouthful.
It is. It's a complicated word when you say Accessory dwelling unit. People go, what is that? Is that just an
Yeah.
apartment? I mean, it sounds like it's just an apartment.
Yeah, it's a admittedly bad name. And so, we in Portland now, most homeowners anyway, if you say the word ADU, they know what it means. But yeah, like outside of Portland where ADUs are heavily concentrated. And by the way, so in Portland, there's 2,900 permitted ADUs, but you go next door to Beaverton and there's like 10. And you
Oh,
go to
wow.
Lake Oswego and there's like 5. So there's
Wow.
very discrete and specific reasons why that's the case, and that relates to the regulations, which relates to people's perceptions of these things. So so there's some really interesting politics at play, both locally and now at the state level. There's legislation that's coming forward in both Oregon and Washington to aggressively promote or require jurisdictions to have better ADU regulations than they currently do. So I think what we're going to see is a lot more ADU activity in areas that have the right economic preconditions for ADUs to take off. That is to say, areas that are experiencing an affordable housing crisis, which is like the greater metropolitan area around Portland, Bend, Hood River, Eugene, Ashland. Maybe some coastal cities, and then up in Washington, we're talking the greater Seattle area. Maybe you could say like Olympia and some of the other towns along the I-5 corridor, but areas where land isn't quite as expensive, we're probably never going to see ADUs take off there in any substantial way. So ADUs have a role to play in certain cities, depending on the economics of those cities and depending on whether or not they're dominated by single family residential zoning, which almost every jurisdiction is.
Wow.
Let's
Yeah.
talk about that a little bit. You kind of touched on it. What is the reason that ADUs have grown? Is it because housing in Portland is so expensive?
Yeah, so imagine, so like they're really taking off in between the Willamette River and 82nd Avenue, and they're not taking off on the east side of 82nd Avenue, even though the regulations are the same. So why is that? Well, the regulations are just as good on the east of 82nd, but if you wanted to buy, let's say you were like, I need a place for Granny, and you're like, I can either buy this $300,000 house next door, or I can build an ADU, and that fixed cost for an ADU right now is quite high. We're talking like $200,000 for like an 800 square foot ADU.
Sure.
So if that's the case, is it a rational thing to build an ADU, or is it more rational to buy the adjacent property next door? Well, east of 82nd, you'd buy the property next door. But if you're in inner Portland, where property values are like $600,000 at this point, it's more rational to build on that really expensive piece of dirt. So you're
Wow.
only going to see ADUs built where land is extremely expensive.
That makes sense.
That is a lot to take in, and of course we're talking about the Portland metropolitan area right there, downtown, and that there's so many different situations as you get into the suburbs around a big city like Portland, or talking to somebody in Medford or Eugene or something like that. And obviously there's rules all around, and we need to cover all that stuff. We got to take a quick break. Don't go away. We're talking about ADUs. You're listening to Tony and Corey, your Weekend Warriors. We'll be right back. Par Lumber is committed to providing the best customer service. We provide personal service. We're problem solvers. We're positive and courteous. We're competent and professional. We are committed to delivering exceptional service every time. We're appreciative and we care. We are Par Lumber.
Hey, welcome back to the Weekend Warriors Home Improvement Show. Thanks for staying with us. Today on the show, we're talking with Cole Peterson from buildingandadu.com. He is a expert on ADUs. It's all he does.
He is the
ADU
authority in the Portland metro area.
The authority, yes. So, Cole, we've got you in the studio. We're talking about, in the first half, kind of the first segment, we were talking about what an ADU was. And, during the break, we were kind of talking about where did they come from? Like, how did this whole thing even start? I mean, I understand the economic thing, houses are expensive, so people are thinking, I'll build an apartment on my property. I mean, is that kind of the thought process?
Yeah, so step back 120 years, like early 1900s, ADUs, or what were effectively the same thing as ADUs, but they might have been called carriage houses or in-law suites or servants' quarters.
Yeah,
These
servants'
these have been
quarters.
around for like hundreds of years. In fact, I'd say something you could make an argument ADUs have been around since the beginning of mankind. Really, I mean, it's not so it's really just this weird aberration from history that they started to be regulated out of existence between 1950 and 2010. And I say 2010 because in 2010, Portland, focusing in on Portland here, kind of liberalized the regulations, drop some system development charge fees, and then we started to see a rapid resurgence. And Portland has really seen the most rapid kind of acceleration of ADUs anywhere in the United States. The city that we follow in the footsteps of is Vancouver, BC. Vancouver, BC has more ADUs than anywhere else in the United States or anywhere else in North America. And now there's Austin, Texas, and Los Angeles, California. Those are kind of the four jurisdictions that have a statistically significant number of ADUs. That is to say, more than like 1% market penetration.
Mm.
So ADUs have been around for a long time. They were called something else, and then they were kind of talked about a little bit in literature in the 70s and 80s, but it wasn't really until the last 5 years that they've started to get real national attention because they're actually starting to take off in a regulated, permitted environment. Whereas to the extent that ADUs have been taking off, prior to that, in the 70s and 80s and 90s, they've all been unpermitted, informal ADUs. And so those are everywhere. I'm talking like the stats on this show, unbelievably, that something like 10% of all of the housing units in the United States are informal ADUs, which sounds
Oh man.
incredible. So that is to say, you got to wonder if there's so much concerted and defined need for this housing type that people are willing to break the rules to build it, then why aren't they building them legally? Well, it's because the regulations for ADUs suck everywhere in this country except for a few different places, right? So there's a lot of regulatory reform that needs to happen. Like where we are sitting right now, for example, they require owner occupancy, which means that if you wanted to build an ADU on your property, you would have to then commit in the deed to never leaving this property. You could never rent out this property again. If you wanted to build an ADU on this property, you would have to build an additional off-street parking spot in addition to building the structure that's taking up a lot of space. And you might just not have sufficient space. Whereas if you build another structure such as a backyard studio or a backyard bedroom, which you can build, a legal detached bedroom, you don't have to build an additional off-street parking spot. There's no deed restrictions. So a lot of people would build a backyard detached studio or bedroom and then illicitly add the kitchen sink and stove after the fact, and then not have to deal with the owner occupancy requirement, not have to deal with the off-street parking requirement, and thus the karmic cycle of informal ADU development, becomes more obvious. Why are we seeing so many informal ADUs? It's because the regulations suck. So yet there's this huge need for them. So people are building them anyway. And so now state legislators in California, Washington, Oregon are starting to be like, okay, we should not allow for local jurisdictions to be barriers to this form of housing that we feel is actually a good thing for the planet, for the economy, for the environment.
Right.
So it adds essentially you're increasing population density within areas that are inherently difficult to build on. Maybe the dirt is too expensive or there's just not dirt available.
So single-family residential zoning is a phenomena that used to be a pretty small swath of the overall land coverage in cities. So Portland, for example, used to be something like 20% of the land was single-family residential and 33% was multifamily back in 1927. And fast forward to 2005 or 2015, and now we have the land coverage is 42% 2% single family residential and 10% multifamily. So we've locked that land into this inherently low density form of development, which arguably has resulted in this housing crisis that we're dealing with now. That is to say, you can only fit so many houses if in that city if all that land is inherently zoned as single-family residential, which is low density. And so in the center of a major metropolitan area, you don't want low density. You want high density in order to support the goods and services that a city needs in order to function. That is to say, transit. You can't operate transit systems unless there's sufficient density. You can't create good retail corridors unless there's sufficient density. So in jurisdictions that need to see more density in their downtown residential neighborhoods, ADUs are one mechanism to achieve that outcome.
So we're talking about this huge percentage of unpermitted ADUs that have been built because the regulations are hard to deal with. So what is somebody, a homeowner, facing if they have gone out and built this thing and they didn't get it permitted? And whether it's right or not, even if it was built to perfection, it's back there and it's not permitted. And then they decide that it's time to put their house up for sale, and they're going to move on. So the buyer comes in, or whoever it is that's dealing with that. Have you seen this happen? And does it put the homeowner in a tight spot if they've got this ADU that's not permitted? And they're trying to sell their house? Is there somebody going to step in and say, hey, hold on a second. You can't just sell this when this thing on here is, nobody knows whether it's up to code or what's going on there?
Well, that's a great question. It's a long answer, but the short of it is, depending on what aspects of the structure were built with permits, it may not be a problem or it might be a problem. For example, if the actual structure wasn't allowed to be there, then yeah, it's a big problem. You might need to actually tear the thing down.
Ugh.
But if the structure was permitted as, say, a garage or a studio or a backyard, whatever, then, and all you're doing is tricking out the interior, then all you have to do is de-trick out the interior. And depending on what portions of the interior you got permits for, you can probably leave some of that intact. The things that put it over the threshold of being an ADU are the kitchen sink and stove. So if you eliminate the kitchen sink and stove from the equation, oftentimes it might become permissible.
Oh.
But it's a case-by-case basis, unfortunately. So that's a generic kind of answer to a complicated, nuanced, specific, granular question.
Yeah, obviously there's a lot of things that play into that. I mean, you've got egress and windows and tempering and glass and walkway space and, all of those things that play into that. And any of those things could be things that make it not permittable. But they definitely are playing with fire a little bit when you have a piece of property that's valued at whatever it is, $250,000 or $300,000, and now suddenly you're stuck there or have to make changes to something that's already great in order to just turn it into something that's sellable. So it makes sense that if you're going to do something like that, that you want to do it right the first time, so that it doesn't end up just costing you more money to fix it.
Unless the regulations are basically forcing you to do it illicitly.
Right, exactly.
Well, that's kind of where you're starting off with the problems. If you're building something illicitly, like a lot of people do, we always advocate for people to get their, proper permits, get those inspections, so you're above water. You're always doing it right.
Yeah. We've got so much more to talk about. We got to take a quick break. When we come back, more about ADUs. You're listening to Tony and Corey, your Weekend Warriors. Don't go away. Tony and Corey, your Weekend Warriors, with a great quick tip for you. Corey and I are here building this mobile collapsible workbench, and we were just cutting 2x4, 1.5 thick, with his circular saw. Most circular saws come with an adjustable depth cut, and you need to have 1.5 or 2 inches to cut through 2x4, but we're moving now to 3/4 of an inch plywood, and we want to shallow up the depth of that cut so that that blade is not hanging out there when we're cutting something and potentially interacting with something that's underneath the surface that we're working with. It can be dangerous, and this is a safety measure that you should use every opportunity you get. Thanks for tuning in, folks. We'll catch you next time.
Hey, welcome back to the Weekend Warriors Home Improvement Show. Thanks for staying with us. Today in the show, we're talking about ADUs, which are accessory dwelling units. We've got Cole Peterson with buildinganadu.com. He's a professional ADU specialist, and he's answering all of our questions. There's a lot more than I thought in this process.
Oh, it's
way
a lot.
more, way
Yeah.
more than I thought.
Yeah, we thought we could just say, "Hey, we want to build an apartment on our property." I mean, you get a lot, especially with. No, I'm not even gonna say that. You get a lot of people who are just thinking, "Hey, it's my property. It's my property. If I want to build that, I should be able to build it. Or if I want to hire somebody to build it, I should be able to build it." But the fact is, it isn't that simple. And you mentioned actually, Cole, in one of the previous segments, you said that there are a lot of single family properties out there that probably wouldn't even qualify to build an ADU and have it permitted and done like it was supposed to be done. Let's talk about some of those.
Yes, some of those. I actually have a question. Sorry to interrupt.
It's okay.
I didn't want you to stop talking, but I have a question about ADUs in general. I mean, an ADU has to be detached. I mean, what about somebody that wants to convert an old basement? I mean, could that be rolled into the ADU guidelines?
Yeah, absolutely. So the definition that I gave was secondary housing unit on a single family lot. It didn't mention anything about the structural form, right? So the structural form, it provided it as diminutive to the primary dwelling. If the primary dwelling is 1,000 square feet and the ADU is 900 square feet, that is smaller than the primary dwelling. So in Portland, all different structural forms are allowed, and in most jurisdictions around Oregon and probably about half or more in Washington, any structural form is permissible. That is to say, you can do detached new construction, you can do basement conversion ADUs, garage conversion ADUs, ADUs above a garage, attic conversion ADUs, bump out ADUs. Those are all acceptable, viable, totally doable forms of ADUs. What we see in the ones, like in Portland, we have actually really good data about ADUs that are being developed. What we know is that 50 to 60% of ADUs are detached new construction, 25% are garage conversions or ADUs above a garage, and then 25% are basement conversion ADUs. A smaller subset, say 5%, are like bump out ADUs or internal carve out ADUs that are not basements. And to the question about, can I build one on my property? Really, the place to start there is Google your city name, ADU regulations. So Troutdale ADU regulations, and see what it says. Many jurisdictions will say ostensibly that they allow ADUs, and I would say, as an advocate, as an expert, their ADU regulations suck. So you don't really want you don't really want to build an ADU there, because it's going to undermine your property value if you're putting a deed restriction that says you have to live on that property for the rest of your life. If you move away, you have to sell. That's a bummer. So when I say you can't build an ADU there, what I mean to say is I wouldn't recommend people to build an ADU there, and most rational people have opted not to build an ADU there because of those regulations.
People that are in a different need, though, right? A lot of people are probably thinking, I'm going to build this as income property. But some of the people are probably building them for their mother-in-law or their disabled child or something. You know what I mean? If you have a family member that you're taking care of, but you want them in a separate building, some people are just going to do it.
Right.
I mean, I have a need for this. I'm going to build it. Tony and I do this show called Cost versus Value every year. And there's all these projects in there that you rate, that are rated nationally by the National Home Builders Association on your value at what it costs to do it. Some of the things in there, like swimming pools, rate really, really low. But if you want it, you're going to build it anyway.
Yeah.
So it's not that you can't, it's just you wouldn't recommend it.
Right. Well, and I say, so we'll take all these jurisdictions in the greater metropolitan area around Portland, 28 jurisdictions. Literally, there isn't one jurisdiction with even more than 20 ADUs, whereas Portland is 2,900. So the regulations are so bad that so few people want to do it, right? Because if you start down that pathway, you'll quickly realize, oh my God, no way, no thank you. I will do it informally. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I will trick out my basement. I will make it as effectively a separate dwelling. By the way, you can have a separate entrance. You can have a separate bathroom in your basement. You can have egress windows. You can have legal bedrooms. But God forbid you call it an ADU and all of a sudden you have a deed restriction on your property that says you must live on that property for the rest of time, which undermines the economic value of your property, So yeah, there's situations, of course, where you might be building it for a family member. So the two main motivations of why people build ADUs are passive rental income potential and multi-generational household flexibility. Those represent 95% of why people build ADUs. And it's usually a combination of those two over the course of time. People initially want to build it for rental income, and then they're like, maybe I'll want to move away from Portland one day and come back. And so I want to have a place where I can do that. Or maybe I want to build a place that's accessible so that I can have a place where I can actually get inside of it when I'm in a wheelchair in 20 years. And so they're thinking ahead. Those are the kinds of multi-generational motivations that people have.
Sure.
Yeah.
I actually shipped an ADU. I sold the lumber for an ADU where the people that they owned this big, beautiful Victorian home in Portland in Southeast, and they built an ADU, gorgeous ADU, and they moved into the ADU and rented their house out. For way more money than they could have rented the ADU out because they didn't want it. They
Talk
didn't
about
need
downsizing.
they didn't need the big house.
That's a super efficient way to downsize, I would
know.
say.
Yeah, that's what I did. So I did that for 7 years, and so the rental income on the primary house covered the mortgage, and then $1,000 a month. So I made, unlike everybody else, I wasn't paying mortgage. I wasn't paying rent. I was making money off of my housing accommodation. So that's a really compelling use case for ADUs if you're in a 1 or 2 person household, which, by the way, is 2/3 of all the households in the United States.
Wow.
So we have all these 2,500 square foot homes, so 3-bedroom, 4-bedroom homes, which are vastly oversized for the average demographic, which is 1 or 2.6 people per household. So
The
there's a hu-
2004 McMansion, you mean?
yeah, exactly. So the average home, according to the census, is 2,500 feet. And that doesn't at all comport with the demographic demand that's out there. So ADUs are creating a right-sized form of housing to meet that demographic demand in an economically viable way. In other words, it wouldn't make sense to buy an empty lot and then put a 600 square foot house on it because the fixed cost of development is so high that 600 square foot house would cost almost as much as a 2,400 square foot house. On the other hand, there's no need for a 2,400 square foot house for 2/3 of the population.
Right.
So the only way to economically kind of create that form of dwelling within a residential zone is via an ADU.
What are your thoughts on how real estate in general is priced by the square footage?
So with ADUs anyway, you're looking at it on a per square foot development cost basis is a very bad way to look at it because it's so expensive per square foot.
Right.
Yeah. So the bigger you go, the cheaper it is, and per square foot. So ADUs, even though they're small dwellings, are very, very, very expensive to build. And so that is kind of the number one message that I am oftentimes hammering into homeowners who are going to start down this process. And so that quickly ties into how in the world am I going to pay for this thing that's going to cost $200,000? And then furthermore, to make it even more complicated, there's no good financing options for you. So you have to somehow come up with $200,000. And by the way, people who are building ADUs aren't wealthy because you wouldn't build an ADU if for the people who are building ADUs are doing so for economic reasons.
Right.
Right? They're not super loaded. They're middle income people. So if there isn't good financing options, how in the world do you get $200,000 to do it? So that is part of what I, teach homeowners is how to go about that mentality of entering the process like a developer would have to.
I'm very curious about that. I kind of want to know, we're running out of time this segment, but I want to know, where does somebody start? The average homeowner, if you're sitting on a piece of property where it makes sense that you want to do some sort of income property, how do you know? You said you Google it, okay, you find out, yes, I can build it. But then what?
Yeah, obviously, just like we talk about any project that somebody's planning, it all starts with a budget, right? And a plan. And so you have to get to a plan and you got to find out whether or not you can afford it and what it's going to cost. And when we come back from this break, I want to talk to you a little bit about if you can help people with the plan based on the size of their thing. We're going to take a quick break. You're listening to Tony and Corey, Your Weekend Warriors. We'll be right back. Don't go away.
Tony, the next thing we need to do is put up what's called nail stops. When the sheetrocker comes in here, he's going to want to put a sheetrock up with screws or nails. And if he drives it through where there's an electrical wire, that could cause a disaster, a fire, all kinds of situations.
Are we going to run into a problem if we're using nail stops and he's using screws?
Not at all.
Do we need screw stops?
I think they'll stop both.
Okay, good.
So let's put these up here. We're going to, everywhere where there's a piece of wire that comes through a stud or through the top plate, we need to install one of these to protect that wire.
Absolutely. We don't want any electrified screws.
We're going to put this over here where the wires come down through the top plate and nail them on. And that's it. Hey, welcome back to the Weekend Warriors Home Improvement Show. Thanks for staying with us. If you haven't already, go check out our social media online. We're at WW Home Show on Instagram and Facebook. We're also on YouTube. If you're interested in watching that, you can go to YouTube and search the Weekend Warriors. Or if all of that's too difficult, go to par.com. That's PARR.com. Click on the Weekend Warriors link, and you can follow all of that stuff.
Yeah.
So go check that out. So today in the studio, we've got Cole Peterson, who is a expert on ADUs, which are accessory dwelling units. And we've been talking a lot about kind of some of the history behind them. But let's say somebody wants to do one. Where do they start?
Yeah, so I would start by just, looking at the regulations and seeing whether the regulations are palatable. Google the name of your town, then ADU regulations, and hopefully you'll find ADU regulations. And let's assume for the sake of this conversation that they look good to you and you want to proceed. So then, I kind of flip things on their head a little bit, and knowing what I know about the costs of development, I usually tell people the very first step is to figure out whether you have sufficient finance and sufficient money to build these things. And then the question is, well, how much do these things cost? Well, that's a broad question. It can cost $5,000 or it can cost $200,000. Where on the spectrum is it going to cost? Well, it all depends on the structural form of an ADU that you're going to build and what you have to work with. So if, for example, you're taking a finished basement and all you want to do is create a second kitchen in it and effectively create an ADU, that could be like a $10,000 job. But in most cases, we're talking about taking an unfinished basement, for example, and finishing it out to an ADU. And then that's going to cost closer, $80,000 to $120,000. Detached new construction for a 400 square foot ADU in the Portland market, it's going to be about $120,000 as the floor for the cheapest 400 square foot ADU you could possibly build. And then for an 800 square foot ADU, the floor right now with design, build, permitting, and sweat equity, included in that value, is about $180,000. So depending on what type of ADU you're going to build, you need to know how much it's going to cost roughly, and then you can back your way into understanding how you're going to pay for this thing.
Okay. That's quite a bit more than I think people are expecting.
Yeah.
When you think a small building, it can't be much more than a shed, right? But developmental costs, you're talking about parking requirements. Are there parking requirements in most jurisdictions that allow them?
Yeah, so most jurisdictions require that you build an additional off-street parking spot. So that means you have to extend your driveway, which is like, $5,000 if you have to extend your driveway. If you have to build a covered parking spot, that can be like $30,000, right? So Bend, Oregon requires additional off-street covered parking spots. And a lot of jurisdictions have off-street parking requirements. And then there's So this is not akin to building a shed at all. Think of it more like this. Think of it as building a house, and then you shave off a little bit of that money. Like you shave off. I mean, that's what it is. It's building a house. So I think it's you have to reframe because you're building a kitchen. Kitchen's going to cost $20,000 minimum.
Yeah.
Bathroom $10,000 minimum. Foundation, $15,000 minimum. Utility connection fee, electrical utility connection service upgrade, $4,000.
Yeah.
Designer, professional designers right now are charging $8,000 to $10,000. So you add all these fixed costs up that don't even look at the structure that you're building,
right?
And all of a sudden you're already at like $80,000.
Yeah.
So. But of course, if you're doing a conversion of a pre-existing permitted structure, such as a garage or such as a basement, you can reduce those costs significantly. And if there's been permitted finish work done within those spaces, then you can reduce the cost further still. So we talked about first step, regulation, second step, what kind of cost are we talking about, and how are you going to finance it? Once you've gotten through that step, then you can get into the conventional method would be find a designer, get us a design, shop it around for a GC. And I say, don't do that either. Flip that on its head. Find a builder first. That's, in this market these days, and I think this is probably true in every market where ADUs are going to be popular, there's a labor shortage. There's not enough general contractors. There's too much work. There's too much commercial, residential, rehab work going on. And so finding a builder is tough. And if you get a builder, a lot of them are going to be 6 months out before they can start a big job like an ADU. A lot of, by the way, the general people who do ADUs are GCs that do like 1 to 3 per year. It's not big shops, right? It's more It's small shops that are GCs that are kind of project managing and hiring laborers to do various facets of the work. So to find those kind of guys, they don't have the capacity to handle 20 ADUs a year. They can do 3 a year. So they're 6 months out before they can start. So you want to find a builder because they're the ones who are actually going to give you an accurate bid or give you an accurate scope of what a project like this might cost. And then you can start reverse engineering a design based on your budget, based on that relationship you have and what that builder advises you can actually get done within that budget.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing that I took away from that, I mean, it was a lot, but the interesting thing is that there is a bare minimum starting cost. I mean, you referenced $80,000, but there's a bare minimum starting cost. Doesn't matter how big it is. If you're going to pour a foundation, if you're going to put a kitchen in, a bathroom, a bedroom, if you're going to side the building and you're going to roof the building, I mean, all of these things, there's a base amount of money, no matter how big it is, no matter how small it is. And then you can start to add, like people will say, oh, $100 a square foot is a pretty good number. Yeah, after your base amount of money that you're going to spend to do the thing, and then you want to make it bigger, then okay, add $100 a square foot to get out to that thing. But that $100 a square foot simply does not consider that first block of money that you're going to have to spend to take on the project. And I think that's something a lot of times people just don't consider.
Yeah. So another way to think about this is imagine you're running a paint crew. You have a 1 square foot block, 1 square foot surface that you need to paint. Is that paint crew going to charge, $20 to come to your site, do the site prep, select the paint from the paint store, do the paint job, and then go home? No, they're not going to charge $20. They're going to charge if it was 100 square feet versus a square foot, are they going to charge a lot less for 1 square foot? No, it's still the same level of work, basically, right? So every facet of the construction process is like that. There's a fixed cost for each of these subcontractors just to get to the site, just to get you the bid, just to get you the materials, to go to Par Lumber, buy the wood. I don't care whether it's 10 sticks or 1 stick, it's still going to take the same amount of time for them.
Right.
So each of these phases of construction, there's a fixed cost to development. And so that's why building small is ironically, or surprisingly much more expensive per square foot. So I say, don't even look at the per square foot cost because it's misleading in terms of the cost of construction for this size structure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Would you say that the average person could take on this project themselves and GC it themselves?
No.
Would you even recommend it?
No.
Not at all.
No.
I mean,
I agree with you.
I do too. I agree with you completely. It is a major, major undertaking. I mean, obviously, you listed off 25 things right off the top of your head that somebody would have to know in order to effectively manage a project like that.
Yeah, I've been in more ADUs than anybody else, period. I've seen 2 people have GC'd their entire ADU from scratch who are average, homeowners. It took them 2 years to do it. I've seen 3 of these. So from start to scratch for new construction. Now, to get more nuanced, a lot of homeowners are able to general contract conversions of pre-existing structures. And I recommend homeowners consider that if they're very, bootstrappy, fiscal, prudent, want to save a lot of money, and they're like ambitious and they're smart.
Patient.
Yeah.
I would add patient to that list.
I'm going to add one more thing because I looked at your website and I saw that you said I had a portion to do with this one job, and I won't get too deep into it, but you were like, I needed to be able to commit 30 hours a week.
Yeah.
30 hours a week. Now that's 30 experienced hours a week.
Right.
So if you're somebody that's not done it before, I mean, maybe that's a full-time job
It's a full-time job.
during that process. So
Yeah, even just general contracting, not lifting a finger would be a full-time job,
yeah,
right? So,
right.
I mean,
I
in this-
GC'd my kitchen remodel
yeah.
that I did myself 3 years ago, and it took 8 months for a kitchen remodel.
Wow,
you know, I
that's
did a lot of
crazy.
sweat equity. Tony did a lot of sweat equity, but I hired my own contractors for the things that I didn't want to tackle. It took me 8 months.
Yeah.
I couldn't imagine building, essentially a home. You're building a home.
It is building a house. So what I will advise for homeowners who are super ambitious is just like you could potentially general contract a conversion of a pre-existing structure, so you're not dealing with the foundation and the framing. It's possible to take on the finish phases of construction as a homeowner contractor.
Oh yeah, we need to definitely talk some more about that. Dig in a little bit more there. We got to take a quick break. We'll be right back.
You're listening to the Weekend Warriors Home Improvement Show, built by Par Lumber. When it comes to big or small projects around the home, Tony and Corey have got the know-how and the answers to make your life just a bit easier. Now, here's Tony and Corey.
Hey, welcome back to the Weekend Warriors Home Improvement Show built by Par Lumber. Thanks for staying with us. If you haven't already, go check us out on our Instagram and Facebook. Go to par.com, click on the Weekend Warriors link, and follow us there. We're also recording the show right now for our video podcast. It's going to be up on YouTube. So make sure you go check that out. Subscribe. If you ever have any questions, you can email Tony and I at the
Weekendwarriors.par. Yep.
Weekend Warriors
At par.com.
at par.com. Not
Weekend Warriors at par.com.
So feel free to email us your questions or comments. We love to hear from you. If you have any questions for Cole, feel free to email us and we can pass those along.
Or you can go to his website at buildingandadu.com. There's probably an opportunity to leave some comments there or at least get your contact information, right?
Yeah, and so if you go to that website, you can sign up for an email that I send out, which has a whole bunch of free resources. It's also a place where I advertise a book that is the most authoritative book on this topic, as well as a web course. So if you're a homeowner and you're considering building an ADU, I'd recommend checking out those resources. I'm doing ongoing free webinars to talk about the different products that I have for homeowners. So sign up for that email list if you're interested in learning more.
You had mentioned earlier a seminar or class that you're getting ready to do. We should probably throw that out there. What's the date of that?
So I teach these ongoing classes on a regular basis for homeowners. I've been teaching that for 8 years, taught over 2,000 people. I teach an ongoing class for realtors through Earth Advantage, which is a local green building organization. I've taught that to over 1,000 realtors, and that's every month as well. But the event that I alluded to is called Accessory Dwelling Academy. It's the first time we will have run this. It's going to be on June 21st, and it's really intended not for homeowners, but for professional builders, designers, realtors, lenders, and appraisers who want to kind of up their game in the ADU market. They want to learn a lot more about ADUs and how to kind of accelerate their business within the ADU realm of things that can be done. Because ADUs are very much an up and coming thing in a lot of markets due to very significant regulatory changes that are happening, actually legislative changes that are happening at both the Oregon and Washington state level. And that is going to dramatically change the ADU market dynamics throughout these states.
So if you're a builder listening, you're going to probably get a lot more questions or project bids about ADUs.
Yeah, and you get there's CCB credits. It also comes with an ADU specialist designation if you pass an exam after the day-long course. Pass the exam, then you get this designation, which sets you apart from all the other general contractors out there because it shows that you have taken the time to learn a whole lot about a whole bunch of aspects of ADU development.
Yeah,
That
awesome.
sounds awesome.
That is awesome. And I know Corey and I work for Par Lumber Company, of course, and we get a lot of questions about this topic. It's a very popular topic. And like you said, the regulations tend to be kind of restrictive. And I think as you're reading through the regulations as somebody who's interested in it, you know, you kind of get lost in them a little bit. And if you could, you know, if somebody just needed to get some advice about how to maybe read through those and understand them better, or maybe there are, I don't want to say loopholes, but, you know, alternative routes that get them to the same result. I feel like you'd certainly be the person to talk to about that, or a class that you're giving might give those exact answers.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm not afraid to talk about loopholes. In fact, I'm a big fan of loopholes. And so I have a whole chapter on loopholes in my book. So read the book, because
nice.
even if your jurisdiction has terrible ADU regulations and it says if you build an ADU, it has to be attached. Well, guess what? breezeways classify as attaching structures oftentimes. So you can create a breezeway between two detached structures, and all of a sudden you have a quote unquote attached ADU.
Structure. All right.
That's a
nice.
great, I call it the breezeway loophole.
Yeah.
It's like reaching out and touching.
That's like a
We're
loophole.
attached now.
That's like a loophole the size of a hula hoop. That's like a hula hoop hole.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good one.
And so I'm all about it, man. You know, take advantage of the loopholes. If the city's going to make it challenging for you, you know, take advantage of the loopholes that they've left out there and exploit those loopholes to accomplish your goals.
Well, it's
Yeah.
government, right? It's government. They just make things harder for you.
I mean, I don't know.
In the building industry.
I mean, certainly sometimes it feels like that for sure. Yeah. So this is super exciting. We did, as we were talking during the last segment, we were wrapping up the last segment. We were talking about homeowners GCing their own projects. And so there's a lot of varying degrees of that, right? If you said, I'm handling this whole thing myself, and you're calling individual subs and you're bringing them in and you're scheduling the whole thing, there's probably some portions of that somebody could do without, I don't know, having to take on the whole thing. But would you say that there are varying degrees that a homeowner could take part and save themselves some money without just saying, I'm simply doing this whole thing by myself?
Yeah. And so, like I said before, it's very, very rare that it makes sense for a homeowner to actually serve as their own general contractor. It only makes sense, I'd say, if they're probably more or less professional builders and they don't have a full-time job and they're super passionate about this project. So that's not really going to apply to most people. What can make sense is for a super ambitious homeowner to hire a general contractor to do the weather-tight shell. That is to say, everything from foundation through, oftentimes all the way through drywall. And then the homeowner can take over as general contractor to sub out, say, the painting and the cabinetry, and maybe hire a plumber to do the finish plumbing fixtures and an electrician to do the finish light fixtures and maybe some of the flooring. Those are the kinds of things that homeowners can oftentimes and will oftentimes take on. And that does save, $10,000, $15,000. But, even that is an extremely ambitious amount of work for a lot of homeowners. So it's not an ill-advised thing at all, literally just to hire a general contractor to do from start to finish for you. In fact, you might be better off in terms of the actual cost savings in the end, because you might very well screw things up if you don't know exactly what you're doing. So in general, I'm like, for the, without knowing an individual, I'd say it makes sense to hire a general contractor to do the whole thing. But a case-by-case basis, it can certainly make sense for homeowners to put in a good degree of sweat equity. And in fact, a lot of homeowners do put in, the statistical average is homeowners put in 10 weeks of sweat equity into an ADU, which is a lot of sweat equity.
Yeah.
It's a lot of sweat.
That's a lot of sweat. Gross. Okay, so somebody has decided that they can afford it. They've decided that the regulations allow it. They've decided that they can get the money. They've sourced it, and now they've contacted a builder, right? And they're gonna get to a GC at some point. But they've got a builder, so they're really moving forward. How do they choose a plan? How do they decide what the plan looks like or what they can fit in there? What's the smallest size they want to have feasibly? How many square feet does one person require? There's a lot of questions there, but I really want to talk a little bit about, what is the bare minimum size of an ADU that's really going to work in your experience, and where are they going to find the inspiration and the motivation that they need to find the right plan that's going to fit them. We're going to talk about that as soon as we come back. We're going to take a quick break. You listen to Tony and Corey, your Weekend Warriors. We'll be right back.
we're ready to put this on the wall, but we have to make sure we put it in the right way. The insulation is made up with the fiberglass, and then this is called the vapor barrier, otherwise known as craft paper or craft face. Craft face insulation, the insulation fiberglass portion goes towards the wall, and then you should see the paper face when you're done.
There's a couple ways to attach this to the studs. You can pull this ear over and fasten it right onto the stud just like this. Or you can put this ear on the inside and fasten it to the inside of the stud. Both are acceptable. The sheetrocker would rather you have it on the inside than the outside in case the staples don't go all the way in.
Hey, welcome back to the Weekend Warriors Home Improvement Show. Thanks for staying with us. Today we're talking about ADUs. We've got Cole Peterson with buildingandadu.com. He's the foremost authority on building them. He knows everything there is to know about it. He's written some books. He does some seminars. If you're interested, if you're thinking about learning more about ADUs, go to that website, buildingandadu.com. And before the break, we were talking about the next step. You know, the first step is you find out if you can even do it. B, you kind of secure your funding to see what you could even afford. You talk to a builder to see what that is. And then you said something about reverse engineering, talking about working with an architect. You know, do you have any tips on finding an architect or, you know, like different construction? You had mentioned construction methods. You know, and being in the lumber industry, I mean, I know a lot of different construction methods. I mean, are you referring to like concrete or wood or zips or, you know, those sorts of things?
Not so much. I was more thinking about let's say you had a budget of $80,000, right? Mm-hmm. And you had a garage.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Or but you were like interested in doing new construction. I would, as a for a consultation, I would come in and say, if you only have $80,000, don't even consider new construction. You can't do it. So go with a garage conversion. And that might be not palatable to you, in which case I would say, just don't do an ADU. You're not financially in a position to do that. But before, there are a number of ways to get access. There are ways to get access to sufficient financial resources. I don't have time to go into all of it, but I teach a lot about that in the book and through my courses. So don't think that you are capped at what you think you are capped at until you read my book and learn, what the suite of potential financing options are. So that's what I meant by, the construction methods.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, when you're working with an architect, and it's the same thing when you're building a home. You're going to sit down with that architect and he's going to talk about different things, or different architects will talk about different things. There's, stick framing, there's advanced stick framing, there's, SIPS panels, structurally insulated, there's, CMU, I mean, there's concrete wall, tilt up. There's so many different construction methods, and all of them come at different costs. And really it kind of depends on what you're trying to achieve. Tony and I have talked on this show about net zero. If you're trying to build a home that is net zero, you could also build a very energy efficient ADU. You could build one that operates at almost net zero, or what's the other one, Tony, from Europe?
Passive
house.
Thank you. Passive
nice.
House. These are the things that you probably should be thinking about up front. There is sometimes there's a lot of cost in some of those aspects, but sometimes there's not. Just building a very energy efficient building with, solar panel ready might be on that list, in my opinion.
Yeah, the Energy Performance Score standard is a standard that's put out there by the Energy Trust of Oregon, and it's also offered in Washington. And that standard looks at energy efficiency and, looks at air quality. And that's the standard that I recommend above all the others in terms of building to a standard that looks at how to reduce your overall energy use by putting in better insulation, air sealing, high performance heating system, high performance water heater. Passive house is a really cool concept, but when you're talking about such a small structure, you don't really need there. Most of our energy use really comes from heating and cooling, and so when you're talking about a really small cubic volume of air, which ADUs are inherently very small cubic volumes of air, i- energy efficiency is almost less relevant. So going for that kind of passive house standard, A, is much harder to achieve for a small structure, but B, it's less relevant because return on investment is like hundreds of years out instead of like
Sure.
20 years out.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. But, building something that's super energy efficient is probably quite a bit easier to do on such a small structure. I mean, you could probably get away with a very small HVAC unit or, some sort of heated floor system. You know what I mean? There's
Yeah.
Most people are going for ductless mini split in our climate these days because it's $3,000-4,000, something like that, for one head unit, and it gives you both heating and cooling. Unfortunately, we now need AC in our region because we're experiencing climate change, whereas we didn't need it like 5 years ago. But that's rapidly changing, and I'm seeing that evolve in the marketplace. So now more and more people are going with ductless mini split because it provides heating and cooling, and it's very efficient too. So that's definitely taking over 75% of the ADU market.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's
Yeah.
really the perfect scenario for a ductless mini split.
So I'm thinking about what the design, what the interior is going to look like, and I'm kind of imagining, and I think a lot of people do this. I'm imagining a tiny house. I see a lot of tiny house plans. It sounds funny. Plans
What's the difference?
plans for building a tiny house, right? And it's I feel like it's very similar. These things sort of cross in what they try to accomplish. But those tiny houses, can be 2 stories tall, or sometimes even more than that if they're creative. Is there a height restriction for a detached secondary unit on your single property?
Yeah. Yeah, it's on your residential property. Yeah,
Yeah.
so there's usually the regulations for ADUs, what I call development regulations, define how high it can be, and a good standard, a standard that you would want to see, is a height limit of 20 feet or so for the midpoint of the gable, or 25 feet for the peak of the gable. Otherwise, you would be forced into doing a one-story structure if it's less than that, and that one-story structure is problematic for a variety of reasons. Then there's regulations that define how big these things can be. In Oregon, the standard, what you see in most jurisdictions, is an 800 square foot limit, and that would be true of the whole metropolitan area around Portland. And then there's regulations that define where on the property it can be located relative to the rear and side yard setbacks, how far it has to be from the front property line, how far it has to be from the primary residential structure, or how close it must be to the primary residential structure. And then there's oftentimes codes that say the ADU can be 800 square feet or X percent the size of the primary house. And if it said something like 25% or 30% or even 50% the size of the primary house, that might kill the project right there. If you have a 1,000 square foot house and you really need to build an ADU for 2 people, then a 500 square foot ADU is just not big enough. What I put out there as a general stick your finger in the wind rule of thumb is 400 square feet per capita is an aggressive downsizing but doable way to think about space. So one person can live in 400 square feet, 2 people can live in 800. I wouldn't go too much less than that.
Yeah, that was good. That's one of my questions. I mean, you have to get some idea of what size of a space you're going to need to be comfortable. And if you think about all the things that have to go in there, I mean, if you just start like this, Corey, you said the smallest room, Cole, I think was about 8 by 10 or 80 square feet or somewhere around that, right? So that's your smallest room. I mean, you've got to have a bathroom. You're going to want a kitchen, and you certainly want to have one separate room that you can sleep and change and do those things. So at the very least, you've got 3 rooms, right? And if they have minimum sizes, then you're already tied to that square footage. And then you have to have a common room. And so you start thinking about those things. And if you have a 2-story, or if you can build a 2-story and still have a 25-foot peak or less, then it certainly opens up your opportunity. But I feel like you kind of have like this weird little ladder thing, or kind of some short stairs with a peaked roof or vaulted ceiling or something in the second story. So there's some weird little nuances that go with that, but it's exciting to talk about those things. I feel like it's, even with all of the talk about the restrictions sucking, I'm still very excited to be a part of that process. I think I would enjoy it.
Speaking of tiny houses, I think it's worth touching on some of the differences between tiny houses on wheels and ADUs because there's a lot of interesting stuff going on and a lot of confusion about that.
There's a lot of people building tiny houses right now. I mean, I feel like they're all over the place, even to the point of not necessarily being on wheels. We got to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk about that. You're listening to Tony and Corey and Cole Peterson. Don't go away.
Hey everybody, here's a quick tip for you when you're using extension cords. If you have to plug in one of your tools, a good thing to do is to tie the ends around like that and plug them in. So that way, if you're working with your tool and you get to the end of your extension cord, it just doesn't unplug, or if it gets caught on something. So that'll help you stay more productive. Hey, welcome back to the Weekend Warriors. Thanks for staying with us. Today in the show, we're talking about ADUs. We've got a professional ADU specialist in the studio with us, Cole Peterson with buildinganadu.com. Before the break, you were alluding to the differences between tiny homes and ADUs. What is the difference? I mean, I would almost think they're the same.
Yeah, so some people might use that term tiny homes when they're talking about ADUs, but I deliberately don't use the word tiny home or tiny house at all. I always use tiny homes on wheels or tiny house on wheels versus an ADU. And those two things are both smaller than the average American dwelling, and tiny houses on wheels are typically up to 200 square feet, whereas ADUs are like oftentimes up to 800 square feet. So they're both smaller than the average American dwelling, but that's where the connection between the two of them ends. They have nothing else in common. Tiny houses on wheels, generally speaking, aren't legal to live in anywhere in the United States in residential zones. They're not built to any code. They're not easily financed. They're not easily insurable. Therefore, you can't legally rent them out in general. Now, so going back to the comment about the sleeping loft, like a tiny house is constrained to being 13 and a half feet high. Why is that? Well, they have to be roadworthy, and so they have to go underneath power lines and whatnot, whereas ADUs don't have to worry about that, right? So in a tiny home, you're oftentimes going to see a sleeping loft, and a sleeping loft is going to have, because you can't fit a legal to code stair in that structure, it's going to have a ladder, and a ladder doesn't meet any code. So therefore, you're going to have an unpermittable sleeping loft with an unpermittable stair leading to it. And so the next question for a lot of people is, can I just take the wheels off the tiny house and turn it into an ADU? And the answer is no, because you can never get that lofted space to meet any kind of formal building code for being a formal bedroom. And that's just one of like 10 things that you can't legally accomplish in terms of converting that to an ADU. So that's kind of the difference. Now, tiny houses on wheels have gotten a lot of attention in the media.
There's
but
like 20 shows on TV about it.
There's so many shows, but none of them happen to mention that it's not legal to live in them. So there's all these people who think that they want to live in a tiny house, but there's basically no way to legally do that. Now, the thing that's fascinating, and I don't mean to confuse matters, is that now, for the first time ever, certain jurisdictions, including Portland, well, actually, really all of Oregon, are now subject to this Oregon Reach Code standard, which was put out by the state of Oregon, which says that tiny homes on wheels are a legal residential dwelling type. But there's still a lot of question marks about how that's going to play out and whether or not local jurisdictions have to create a zoning pathway for those tiny homes on wheels to be placed somewhere. So yeah, it's fine. You can have a tiny house on wheels as a dwelling, but if there's no place to put it other than an RV park, because it's the only place they can legally be placed and slept in, then they're kind of a useless form in terms of a formal approved housing typology.
So you almost need like a travel trailer park, or or like an RV park, or kind of the old trailer park idea where you have essentially big, gigantic tiny homes on wheels.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's-
right.
that's
Another
basically it.
thing that's not new,
It's
right?
another
they've
not new
been
thing. Yeah.
Doing that for a long time. Honestly, when I bought the property that I built my last house on, Corey, you probably remember this. When I bought the property, it had a mobile home on it. Difference between a mobile home and a manufactured home is the mobile home was literally on a trailer with wheels under it. My manufactured home or my mobile home that was on my property when I bought it, and it was old and needed to be torn down, had taillights. It really did. And so we of course tore that down before we built our house on there. But yeah, tiny homes, not really something new, but different, certainly different, and has taken on all new regulations and that kind of thing. And I mean, technically, kind of under the radar.
They are
right?
definitely under the radar.
Even though they're super popular and everybody's talking about it,
Yeah.
they're not addressing it.
Well, let's talk about that for a second, because what is the purpose? Why would somebody build a tiny home if they can't live in it? Is it like a little vacation thing?
Because people don't either know about the regulations or they're saying screw you, planning department, because the planning department isn't allowing them to live in the type of dwelling that they want to live in. So just to be clear, there are standards for mobile homes, or what are now called manufactured homes. That name changed in like the 80s. And then there are standards for RVs. And tiny houses on wheels, there haven't historically been any standards. So they are totally under the radar. And it's almost a form of civil disobedience for people to build them and live in them. But plenty are people doing it. It's not like a huge phenomena, but it's definitely out there. And I don't have a problem with it, honestly. I think it's a good thing. But it's not permissible. It's not allowed.
Well, there's a lot of questions there. Electricity, sewer, water.
Mhm.
Where do you do that? What do you do with those things? I mean, you can't really connect to the city sewer. I mean, or
People do
where
that.
where are they
Not
putting
legally.
So they're putting them on their property and connecting to
Connecting
city sewer.
illicitly to the sewer system, or what's more common than that is using composting toilets,
Oh,
and then
yeah.
some incinerating toilets, and then people always do kind of just run a hose connection from their hose bib, and then they usually just run an extension cord, and then they have a propane heater or a wood burning stove. Now, Caravan, our tiny house hotel, I own the tiny house hotel, first legal place you could stay in a tiny house on wheels anywhere in the U.S. Those are legally connected to the sewer system, so they have normal flush toilets, normal showers with heaters, electric 50 amp connections. So we have infrastructure that's more akin to what you would be familiar or accustomed to seeing in a standard residential house. But most tiny homes on wheels, as a virtue of the fact that they are not legally allowed to be there, are doing composting toilets.
Interesting. Yeah, we actually have talked about that in
We
the
have.
past as well, which is a very interesting thing in and of itself. So what is the name of your place where you said tell me about that. Tell me about your tiny home connection.
Yeah, so I own the Tiny House Hotel. It's in Northeast Portland on Alberta Street, and it's 6 tiny homes on wheels. It was the first place where people could legally stay in a tiny house on wheels anywhere in the U.S. First place with legal connections to the sewer system and water system anywhere in the U.S. Largest collection of tiny houses on wheels at the time. We opened our doors in 2013, and it's a hotel, basically.
That is
if you-
awesome.
We also do tiny house tours there on selected Sundays, so you can go to tinyhousehotel.com if you want to learn about the tours and sign up and see a bunch of tiny houses on wheels that are custom built, one of a kind, unique tiny homes on wheels. And I'm a fan of tiny homes on wheels, but because they are not legal to live in, generally speaking, I've invested more of my energy in ADUs because they draw kind of similar interests and passions among people, but the ADU offers a legal pathway to accomplish the same task or the same goal, which is to create economic freedom and sustainability through housing.
Oh yeah. And honestly, because of the ability to build it bigger and do more, it's really it's still smaller than the standard American dwelling, but allows you to do so much more. And you can do a lot. I mean, in 800 square feet, you can do a lot. I feel like there's people living in studios downtown Portland right now paying an exorbitant amount of money to stay there, and it's just smaller than that, and it's just one room, and that's frankly that's crazy to me. But I guess some people prefer to live that way.
Yeah, and so in some ways, ADUs are creating an apartment, but in terms of the type of people that live in ADUs or would want to rent an ADU, except that unlike an apartment, it's going to be in a residential property with a backyard. And so some people who might not want to live in a place where they can't get direct access to the outside might want to live in a residential zone. And that's kind of like the ultimate thing that ADUs are providing. They're providing a rental stock that can be in a residential zone for this 1-2 person household size, of which 2/3 of our households are 1 and 2 person households.
So we've got to take a break here in just a second, but one of the questions that I want to get an answer to when we come back is, if you build a detached ADU on your property, does it have a separate address from your house, and how does some of the separation work there from the primary dwelling to the ancillary dwelling? We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, answers to that. You're listening to Tony and Corey, your Weekend Warriors. We'll be right back.
Here's another tip with your caulking. You've got a brand new tube, you've just cut the tip off, and you need to puncture that little piece of foil. You take this piece here, or you can take a nail, anything, old screw. What you want to do is when you put it in the tip like that, you want to run it around in a circular motion and really widen that up. Because if you just puncture it with one little hole, that foil inside there is really tough. And a lot of times when you put pressure on the end of the caulking gun with the gun, the caulking will want to worm out and fill that void, and it's going to be really difficult to gun. So if you've ever had a new tube of caulk that you've put in your caulking gun and it's really hard to come out, check that you've really opened that foil up. We're good to go. Hey, welcome back to the show, everybody. Thanks for staying with us. Your Weekend Warriors talking about ADU properties. Mm-hmm. Well, ADUs on your property.
Right.
Before the break, Tony had mentioned you had asked questions about the utilities. And you could shed some light on this, because if you build something on your property, do you just connect the water and sewer to your house? Or, I mean, how does that work?
Yeah. So what you want the code to allow is for you to just extend the utilities to your ADU from your primary dwelling, and usually the code does allow that. So with a sewer, it means that you have to find the sewer stack if you have a basement, and it has to be, say we're talking about a detached ADU that's 20 feet from your primary residence, and you need to have a 1/4 inch drop for every foot of run for that sewer. You need to tap into your sewer in your primary house about, say, like a foot below grade or so, and then it's got a slope, about 2 feet below grade in order for it to have sufficient slope to get out to that ADU. And so somewhere beneath your primary dwelling, you're going to tap into your sewer, and that sewer connection could actually happen outside the envelope, outside the foundation of the primary dwelling, or it could happen inside the house, in which case you'd bore a hole through the foundation wall and connect into that sewer. Water is just extended from the primary house through, usually there's water lines running through the ceiling joists of the basement, and then you poke a hole through the foundation wall and run that out through a trench up into your ADU. Electric, you usually have a single meter head for your primary dwelling, and sometimes, depending on what the electrician and the utility company says, you will put in a secondary meter head. You'll upsize that electrical service to get more than 200 amps, usually like 325, and 325 will be enough to serve both units. And then you'll have 2 meters, and one meter service will be for unit A, and 1 unit service will be for unit B. So you'll have 2 separate electrical meters. And then gas, if you want to run gas at all, you would have 2 meter heads you would have the utility company Northwest Natural, in the Portland's case, would come out and add a secondary meter head for that secondary service, and then there would be 2 bills for that. So that's how the 4 utilities typically work. And depending on the jurisdiction, those costs can be pretty significant. Upsizing the water line service to have sufficient water pressure for an additional, bathroom plus kitchen can cost up to $10,000 in some cases. So So this can be an issue, a municipal issue, because they have to come out, the city has to come out and actually rip up the road in order to change out the water line, the lateral that goes from the water main to the water meter.
Mm-hmm.
So that's expensive work for them. So they have to charge for that. And so that's part of the cost of doing business. The electrical utility, as I mentioned, oftentimes will cost $4,000. So that's like a fixed cost of, $14,000 just for those 2 upgrades. The plumbing, sewer, I mean, you don't have to tap into the sewer main, thank goodness, because that can cost $15,000-$20,000. You just have to extend it from your primary dwelling, and that's just a matter of getting a plumber out there to do that work once you've done the trenching.
And then hope the people in your ADU aren't flushing weird things.
Yeah.
Loading your sewer with wet wipes. It's the worst ever.
Oh, or G.I. Joe action figures. Yeah, little.
Put a note on there. No G.I. Joes.
No G.I. Joes can go in this toilet, just so you know. So what about this? Your home has an address, and it sits on this piece of property, and that's all mapped out, and everybody knows. But now suddenly you put a second dwelling on the same piece of property. Is it going to get a different address, or is it going to be a sub-address of your address? Like maybe if my address is 320, is this going to be 320A or something like that?
Yeah, so why do we have addresses? Well, we have addresses in part so that emergency responders can get to our homes in the case of a fire. And so it is required, at least in Portland, I suspect in most jurisdictions, that when you have a new housing unit, you must have a street address visible from the street in order for emergency responders to get to that unit in the case of a fire. And so the code bottom line says, thou shalt have a visible street address for unit B visible from the street. And so the final certificate of occupancy inspection requires that. And yes, it's usually just the letter B appended to the primary street address, unless you have a detached ADU on a corner lot, in which case it could be actually a whole separate street address that's for a different street altogether. But that's pretty rare.
Interesting. Yeah, that is interesting. I know I'm on a corner lot, my primary residence on a corner lot, and I actually have an approach through the sidewalk on both off of 2 different streets. So there would be an opportunity for me to have a driveway, an approach on a driveway that goes into the back portion of my property there.
On your junior acre.
Or whatever.
It's a made up unit of measure. I don't know if you knew that.
I never heard that one.
Yeah, Corey hadn't either.
There is such a thing called a junior ADU in California. We don't have those up here.
Oh,
they're like carved out ADUs. They basically just require that you put in a firewall between 2 portions of space, and you can add a little kitchenette, but you don't have to separate the utilities. It's a phenomena that's is just in California. It's not really anywhere else in the
Maybe
US.
if you have a really big house, you could carve out a
Yeah.
small portion of it, but you have to have a firewall.
Yeah, just 2 layers of 5/8" drywall is a 1-hour firewall, and that's like the standard. What you have to put in when you're creating a new housing unit adjacent to an existing housing unit.
Let's talk about that a little bit, because fire code, I see a lot of it in the construction industry. What I do, I actually go over a lot of those fire assemblies. Are you required? If anything's parked next to your home, you have to think about that, right?
Yeah, so the fire code says that if you have 2 adjacent structures, if any 2 points on either the vertical or horizontal plane are within 6 linear feet, then you must fire rate those structures or those portions of those structures. But so I usually recommend, to keep things simple, keep 6 feet of separation between the eaves of the structures, and you should be good to go. But if you can actually get closer than that, but then you just have to fire rate those eaves and those walls, and that can add a little bit of cost. But it's not a killer. It's just something you have to account for. And then you can get those structures down to being 3 feet of separation. And then when you're talking about attached ADUs, i.e., a basement ADU, let's say, then you have to put that fire rated wall in the ceiling assembly between the 2, and usually that's 2 layers of drywall, but it can be accomplished in a number of different ways.
Yeah. That makes sense. The last question, we're running out of time, but I want to know about, or what you know about, rentability. Or Airbnb. If somebody was thinking about doing this, can they just throw it on Airbnb and have all that as legal? As a legal rental?
Yeah. So let's be clear. Airbnb is one form of a short-term rental. A short-term rental is a space that's rented out for less than 30 days. at a time. And otherwise, it's a long-term rental by most conventional municipal standards. So yes, you can rent out the ADU long-term, no problem. Every jurisdiction allows for that. Some jurisdictions have owner occupancy requirements, so you can't rent out both units. But in all jurisdictions that I know of, you can rent out one or the other. But then short-term rental regulations are an up-and-coming kind of phenomena that certain jurisdictions like Portland are now regulating, and they're saying, you can rent up to 2 bedrooms on your property. And Portland is silent on whether those 2 bedrooms are housed within the ADU or the primary dwelling. But there are portions of the regulations that say if you have a short-term rental, you have to live on that property X number of months a year. I think it's like 9 months a year. And you have to get those bedrooms inspected to ensure that they're legally built. They have egress windows and smoke detectors. Now, what Portland has done is they've waived system development charges for ADUs to incentivize them, but they've said if you're going to use it for a short-term rental, we are not going to waive the system development charge. So you're going to have to pay an extra $15,000 to $19,000 in order to build that ADU because a short-term rental unit is not accomplishing the goals of Portland's interest in building ADUs, which is to create more affordable housing.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting that you say that. I mean, that's literally just a question, right? At the city. The city says, are you going to rent this thing out?
Is that all the more that's involved in that?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, so Portland is supposedly going to start cracking down on this, but they've been saying that for years. So we'll see. There's 6,000 short-term rental units on Airbnb alone and only 1,000 legal permitted short-term rental permits out there. So 1 out of 6 are complying with the code currently.
There you go.
Wow. That is amazing.
Good to know.
Yeah. I got to tell you, I went to your website, the tinyhousehotel.com. Great website. This is very cool. I mean, just looking at these pictures makes me want to go there.
That's the idea.
And stay in that place. It's absolutely phenomenal looking. That is something I definitely want to plug for you. Thank you, Cole Peters, for being with us. That's buildinganadu.com. This has been another episode of Your Weekend Warriors.
Right here on the Weekend Warriors Radio Network.
Have a great week.